Most people picking up a package of ground beef assume they're choosing between dozens of different companies. They're not. We spent weeks tracing ownership records, federal court filings, USDA recall data, and labeling laws straight to the source. What we found is that almost every package in that meat case traces back to one of four corporations, two of them foreign-owned, and the label on the front rarely tells you that. Some of these companies have paid hundreds of millions of dollars in fines for price fixing and bribery. Some are legally allowed to sell you meat from cattle that never set foot in America and still call it product of USA. And one filler product got quietly reclassified so it no longer has to be disclosed at all. This isn't a story about one bad batch or one bad brand. It's a story about how an entire industry got small enough and quiet enough that the average shopper lost the ability to tell one company from another just by reading a label. You grab a bag because it's the store brand you trust, or the name your parents bought, or the one with the friendliest packaging. Almost none of that packaging tells you who actually owns the plant your beef came from, what that company has been sued for, or whether the animal ever touched a blade of grass. We're counting down 8 ground beef categories from concerning to genuinely shocking, and finishing with 3 that are verified, third-party certified, and actually what they claim to be. Let's get into it. Number 8. Store brand ground beef sold as product of USA. Start with the sticker. Nearly every big chain in the country sells a house brand ground beef with an American flag or the words product of USA printed somewhere on the label. Most shoppers read that as a guarantee. This cow was born here, raised here, slaughtered here. That is not what the label legally means, and until January of 2026, it never had to be. For years, federal rules allowed any beef processed or repackaged inside a USDA-inspected American facility to carry a product of USA label, even if the animal was born, raised, and slaughtered entirely in another country. Cargill has publicly stated that beef it imports from Canada, Mexico, Australia, New Zealand, and Nicaragua meets the product of USA labeling standard once it passes through domestic processing. That is not a fringe claim. That is the company saying it in plain language. About 12% of the beef consumed in the United States comes from imported cattle, and a meaningful share of it ends up wearing a USA label by the time it reaches the shelf. A USDA consumer research study found that 84% of Americans believe product of USA means the animal itself was born, raised, and slaughtered domestically. The label was built to exploit that exact misunderstanding. The USDA finalized a new rule that tightens this standard, but it only became effective in January 2026, and it remains largely voluntary enforcement in practice while litigation over older labeling loopholes continues to work through federal court. Until every package on the shelf is produced under the new standard, that flag on the front of the bag tells you almost nothing about where the animal actually lived its life. State attorneys general and independent cattle ranchers didn't wait for Washington to fix this quietly. A coalition of 11 state attorneys general has intervened in ongoing litigation specifically to defend truth in labeling enforcement for American beef, arguing that federal approval of a misleading label should never override a state's ability to protect its own citizens from exactly this kind of confusion. Ranchers in South Dakota took the fight to federal court directly, and in January 2025, a district court denied the defendant's motion to dismiss, allowing the case to proceed. The fact that this required a multi-state legal coalition and an active federal lawsuit just to enforce what most shoppers already assumed the label meant tells you how far the loophole had been allowed to stretch. You paid a patriotism premium for a label that was, for over a decade, legally allowed to mean nothing. Number 7. Any ground beef processed through the Big Four. Here is the number that should genuinely stop you with the meat case. 4 companies, Tyson, Cargill, JBS, and National Beef, now control roughly 85% of all beef processing in the United States. In 1980, those same 4 companies controlled just 36%. That is not organic growth. That is 4 decades of consolidation that quietly erased almost every alternative you think you have. Walk down the meat aisle and you'll see what looks like competition. A dozen different bags, a dozen different logos, regional names, store names, heritage-sounding names. Almost all of it was slaughtered and processed inside a plant owned by one of these same 4 companies. 2 of the Big Four, JBS and National Beef, are foreign-owned. National beef is controlled by the Brazilian company Marfrig. JBS is Brazilian as well, and it is currently the largest meat processor on Earth. This concentration didn't happen by accident, and it hasn't been free of consequences. Cattle producers have testified for years that consolidation lets these four companies dictate what ranchers get paid for their animals, while consumers simultaneously pay more at the register. The federal government has openly called for antitrust investigation into potential collusion and price manipulation across this exact industry. When four companies process the overwhelming majority of a product that touches almost every American kitchen, the illusion of choice on the shelf becomes exactly that, an illusion. Number 6. Tyson processed ground beef. Tyson is one of the most recognizable names in American meat, a company Americans have trusted in their kitchens for generations. What most shoppers don't know is that Tyson isn't just a chicken company. It's one of the four corporations that dominate the beef supply, and it has been named directly in federal litigation over how that beef gets priced. A sweeping antitrust lawsuit filed in the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota alleged that major beef processors including Tyson Foods and Tyson Fresh Meats conspired between 2014 and 2019 to allocate markets and limit competition, coordinating pricing and production decisions in a way that artificially inflated what consumers paid at the grocery store for cuts including chuck loin rib and round. Tyson and Cargill agreed to pay a combined $87.5 million to settle claims brought by consumers in more than 24 states, with the claims window remaining open through June 2026. Other companies named in the same complaint have not settled. Read that again. Two of the four companies that process most of America's beef were accused, in federal court, of working together to keep prices artificially high, and they wrote a check rather than litigate it to a verdict. That settlement doesn't require Tyson to admit wrongdoing, and it doesn't undo years of grocery bills that may have been inflated by exactly the practice they were accused of. The name on the package sells trust. The federal docket tells a different story. Consumers in 26 states and Washington, D.C. are eligible to file a claim in that settlement, which means the case affected a genuinely national footprint, not a regional supply quirk. Meanwhile, Tyson's ground beef bags still lean on decades of home-style family farm branding, the same visual language of red barns and rolling pasture that every other major processor uses, regardless of whether a single animal behind that label ever grazed on anything at all. Number 5. Cargill processed ground beef. Cargill is privately held, which means it never has to answer to shareholders the way public companies do, and it rarely has to explain itself to the public at all. It is also one of the four companies that decide what most of the country pays for beef, and it was named in the exact same price-fixing complaint as Tyson. Beyond the antitrust settlement, Cargill is also the company that publicly confirmed the product of USA labeling practice described earlier, openly stating that beef it imports from 5 different countries can legally carry an American label once it passes through domestic processing. That's not a company hiding a loophole. That's a company telling you the loophole exists and using it anyway, because nothing in the law stopped it until this year. Cargill doesn't put its name on a bag the way Tyson does. It processes beef that then gets sold under store brands, regional names, and private labels you've never connected to a multinational commodities company. That's precisely the problem. You can avoid a name on a package. You cannot avoid a name that was never printed on it in the first place. If your grocery store's private label ground beef doesn't disclose its processor, there is a real chance Cargill is the answer, and you would have no way of knowing. Number 4. JBS owned ground beef, including Swift. JBS is the largest meat processing company on the planet, and its corporate history reads less like a food company and more like a criminal case file. In 2017, J&F Investimentos, the Brazilian holding company that controls JBS, agreed to pay a record 1030 billion reais, roughly $3.2 billion, to Brazilian authorities after its owners, brothers Josley and Wesley Batista, admitted to bribing more than 1,800 government officials to secure over $1 billion in loans from Brazil's State Development Bank and public pension funds. That wasn't the end of it. In 2020, the same holding company pleaded guilty in U.S. federal court and agreed to pay $256 million to the Department of Justice and the SEC for violating the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, using American bank accounts and shell companies to funnel bribery proceeds into expanding JBS's operations inside the United States. Combined with the earlier Brazilian penalty, that's well over $3.4 billion in fines tied to bribery and corruption at the company that owns your local Swift-branded ground beef. JBS was also named in the same antitrust price-fixing complaint as Tyson and Cargill, accused alongside its Swift Beef Company and JBS Packerland subsidiaries of coordinating with competitors to inflate beef prices between 2014 and 2019. Unlike Tyson and Cargill, JBS has not settled that portion of the case. The company that pled guilty to bribing nearly 2,000 officials on one continent is still fighting a price-fixing lawsuit on another, and his ground beef is sitting in your grocery store right now under a name that sounds as American as apple pie. Number 3. Any ground beef containing undisclosed, lean, finely textured beef. This is the ingredient the industry fought hardest to keep off your radar, and in 2018 it won. Lean, finely textured beef, LFTB, better known by the name that made it famous, pink slime, is produced by taking leftover beef trim, the fatty scraps left after cutting steaks, warming it, spinning it in centrifuges to separate out the fat, and then treating the resulting paste with ammonia gas or citric acid to kill bacteria like E. coli. The product is roughly 94 to 97% lean, and it has historically been used to bulk up ground beef while lowering its fat content and its cost. At its peak, LFTB was estimated to be present in around 70% of the ground beef sold in American supermarkets, almost always without separate disclosure on the label. When ABC News reported on the practice in 2012 using the term pink slime, public backlash was immediate. Sales collapsed. The manufacturer, Beef Products Inc., closed plants and laid off hundreds of workers. BPI then sued ABC News for defamation and won a settlement of more than $177 million in 2017, one of the largest media defamation payouts in American history. Here's the part almost nobody knows. In December 2018, the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service quietly reclassified LFTB so that it can now legally be labeled simply ground beef, with no separate disclosure required at all. The product that triggered a national scandal, a defamation lawsuit, and a 9-figure settlement is now permitted to disappear completely into a label that just says ground beef, the same 2 words on every package in the case. The USDA says it's safe. The European Union and Canada still ban the ammonia-treated version for human consumption. You no longer have any legal way to know, from the label alone, whether it's in your bag. Some retailers made public commitments to stop buying it after the 2012 backlash, and to their credit, several major chains have held to that promise for over a decade. Others never made the commitment publicly at all, and because the label no longer has to disclose it either way, there's no practical method left for a shopper standing at the meat case to independently verify which category their store falls into. The texture is often the only clue left. Ground beef, built partly from LFTB, tends to hold together in an unusually uniform, almost paste-like way when raw, without the loose, slightly rough texture of beef that was simply trimmed and ground. It's not a reliable test. It's the closest thing you have left. Number 2. Ground beef packaged with carbon monoxide or modified atmosphere gas. Press your thumb into a package of ground beef at the store. If it's a uniform, almost unnaturally bright cherry red all the way through, that color may not be telling you what you think it's telling you. Fresh beef is naturally red and begins turning brown within days as it's exposed to oxygen, a completely normal and harmless process that consumers have always used to judge freshness. Modified atmosphere packaging changes that. Since 2004, the FDA has permitted processors to package meat, including ground beef, in sealed trays infused with small amounts of carbon monoxide alongside other gases. The carbon monoxide binds to myoglobin in the muscle tissue and locks in that bright red color for extended periods, in some cases for up to a full year, regardless of how fresh the meat underneath actually is. A formal FDA petition filed by a competing food ingredient company argued that the practice deceives consumers and creates a risk of foodborne illness by letting meat remain fresh-looking beyond the point at which typical color changes would indicate aging or bacterial spoilage. The concern is straightforward. Color has always been the primary way shoppers judge whether meat is still good, and this process defeats that signal without changing what's actually happening to the meat itself. Some major retailers have publicly refused to sell carbon monoxide-treated meat specifically because of the consumer deception concern, citing it by name as their reason. Others have never made that commitment. The gas itself, at the low concentrations used in packaging, is not typically considered a direct poisoning risk to the consumer. The risk is what it hides. A package that looks like it was cut yesterday may have been sitting far longer than the color on the label would ever suggest to you. Before we get to number 1, it's worth pausing on how often this entire category ends up back in the news for the most basic safety reason there is. In just the 7 months leading into this investigation, the USDA's Food Safety and Inspection Service issued multiple separate ground beef recalls and public health alerts for E. coli contamination alone. In December 2025, a Idaho processor recalled nearly 2,900 pounds of ground beef, including a grass-fed product, after routine testing detected E. coli 026. In February 2026, another Idaho establishment recalled close to 23,000 pounds of coarse ground beef for possible E. coli 0145 contamination. These weren't small artisanal operations cutting corners. They were licensed, federally inspected facilities that still let contaminated product reach the point of shipment before anyone caught it. Recalls happen across the entire size spectrum of this industry, from the smallest regional processor to the largest multinational packer. And the frequency is a reminder that USDA inspected is a floor, not a guarantee. It's one more reason the sourcing questions in this list matter as much as the price on the sticker. Number 1. Grass-fed or organic ground beef with no verifying certification. This is the one that will change how you shop for good. Grass-fed and organic are two of the most trusted words on any meat label in America, and they are also two of the most loosely enforced. USDA organic certification for beef requires organic feed and prohibits antibiotics and added hormones. It says nothing about whether the animal ever ate grass. An animal can spend its entire life on organic grain in a feedlot and still legally wear the organic seal. Grass-fed is worse. Unless the package also states grass-finished and carries independent, third-party verification, the claim tells you almost nothing enforceable. An animal can be fed grass for most of its life and then finished on grain in a feedlot for its final months, the period that has the largest impact on the fat composition of the meat. And the label can still say grass-fed with no legal obligation to disclose the switch. Industry estimates suggest that as much as 97% of beef sold in the United States is finished in a feedlot, regardless of what the front label implies about pasture. Some brands marketed specifically to health-conscious families source grass-fed beef internationally from Uruguay, Australia, or elsewhere, blend it with limited domestic supply, and print it under a label designed to look homegrown. The only way to know for certain is a genuine third-party certification printed on the package, the American Grass-Fed Association seal, certified regenerative by AGW, or explicit USDA verification of the full grass-fed and grass-finished claim with an audit trail behind it. No seal, no proof. A brand that wanted you to know for certain would have gotten the certification. The ones that didn't are counting on you not asking the question. If this investigation is already changing how you look at the meat case, you're about halfway through. The next part is where things get better, not worse. 3 brands actually back up every claim on their label with independent verification, and none of them belong to the Big 4. Best option number 3. U.S. Wellness Meats. U.S. Wellness Meats has been selling exclusively grass-fed and grass-finished beef since 2000. More than 2 decades of operating a single focus model instead of pivoting in and out of the category the way larger companies do. Every animal is raised without GMO feed, antibiotics, or growth hormones, finished entirely on pasture using regenerative grazing practices across a network of family farms. The company doesn't blend in feedlot finished beef to stretch supply, and it doesn't source internationally to pad volume, because it operates outside the Big 4's processing infrastructure entirely. U.S. Wellness Meats controls its own supply chain from pasture to package, instead of routing cattle through a plant owned by Tyson, Cargill, JBS, or National Beef. That traceability is the entire point. You're not trusting a label. You're trusting a company that has kept the same standard for over 20 years because the standard is the product. Best option number 2. Force of Nature. Force of Nature built its entire business around regenerative agriculture, a farming model designed to rebuild soil health rather than deplete it, with 100% grass-fed beef as its foundation product alongside other pasture-raised meats like bison and elk. The company holds Certified Regenerative by AGW status and American Grass-Fed Association certification, two of the most rigorous third-party audits available in the entire meat industry, verifying not just the animal's diet but the land management practices behind it. This matters because regenerative grazing has a measurable impact on the nutritional profile of the meat itself, including a more favorable balance of omega-3 to omega-6 fatty acids compared to conventionally finished beef. Force of Nature has built a loyal following specifically within the ancestral and Whole Foods health community, not through marketing claims but through certifications that require ongoing, independent audit rather than a one-time label approval. When a company chooses to carry two separate rigorous certifications instead of one convenient claim, that's a company inviting scrutiny instead of avoiding it. Best option number 1, ButcherBox. If Force of Nature and U.S. Wellness Meats represent the gold standard for people ready to commit to a direct source model, ButcherBox is the most practical entry point for a household that wants verified humanely raised, 100% grass-fed and grass-finished beef delivered on a predictable schedule without hunting down a farm direct supplier themselves. It has grown into the largest grass-fed beef subscription service in the country, and its sourcing standards, no antibiotics, no added hormones, verified grass-fed and grass-finished, are consistent across every box rather than varying by cut or season. The trade-off is the same one every genuinely clean option on this list shares. It costs more than a bag of Big 4 ground beef at the regular grocery store, and it requires you to plan a delivery instead of grabbing a package on the way home. That inconvenience is real, and it's also the direct result of a company that isn't routing cattle through a plant that also processes for 3 of its largest competitors under 3 different store labels. Before you close this, here's the one rule worth keeping. Flip the package over before it goes in your cart. If the label says grass-fed or organic without a named third-party certification next to it, treat the claim as marketing, not fact. If there's no processor or country of origin information disclosed at all, assume it passed through one of the 4 companies that control 85% of this industry, because statistically, it almost certainly did. You don't need to memorize which subsidiary belongs to which parent company. You need one habit. Look for the certification, not the adjective. Grass-fed is an adjective. American Grass-Fed Association is a certification. Organic is an adjective when it comes to your cow's actual diet. USDA certified organic with a full grass-fed and grass-finished audit trail is proof. The Big 4 spent decades building labels designed to sound like proof without ever requiring it. Now you know the difference. None of this means you have to abandon your grocery store entirely or spend 3 times your normal budget on every meal. It means the next time you're standing in that aisle, you check for a name that isn't Tyson, Cargill, JBS, or National Beef hiding behind a store label. You look for an actual certification logo instead of a comforting word. And you remember that the color of the package under fluorescent lighting was never designed to help you. It was designed to sell to you. 4 companies spent 40 years buying up almost every alternative you thought you had. That's the part of the story they were counting on you never hearing. If this changed how you think about what's actually in your cart, passing it along to someone who buys ground beef every week is probably the most useful thing you can do with it.